space. 8 years later, sadly, we live in a world where that's a minor miracle. Thanks to all the folks who did the cooking, and thanks a lot to all of you for coming. Where to start? Good thing I have notes. So let's just, to set things up, talk about one tiny little facet of this hellscape that we're living in currently. Just looking at global warming, which is a term that I don't like to use that much for reasons I'll get into, but it's a term that gets used a whole lot in the mainstream. Global warming. So according to fairly consensus upon models for climate change and warming, based on current levels of greenhouse gas emissions and then projected realistic levels of greenhouse gas emissions over the coming years and decades, the likely scenario, a conservative estimate for the likely scenario, is at least 1 billion human beings dying because of global warming by the end of the century, and high likelihood of going up to or past 2 degrees of warming. We're already hitting the 1.5 degree of warming mark, more than a decade, I think, ahead of schedule. And so with that, that could easily lead, especially as we start to cross certain global tipping points, like the melting of the ice sheets, reversal of certain ocean currents, could easily lead to like the 6th or even the 5th largest mass extinction event in the planet's history. And right now already many humans are being killed by extreme weather events, drought, rising temperatures, and other associated crises. Habitats all over the world are being really damaged or destroyed. So that's it's a billion people getting killed by this thing that is being produced by capitalism is it's a big deal. How does that make y'all feel? Just can you even wrap your head around that? A billion humans getting killed in the rest of the century. How does it make you feel trying to wrap your head around that? Trying to face it?
Overwhelming?
Overwhelming, that's a great word. Overwhelming, for sure. And also, while I remember, als ich nicht so gut Deutsch spreche, ich mache das auf Englisch. Ich glaube, dass viele Menschen hier sprechen Englisch nicht als erste Sprache, so bitte, in any moment, interrupt me if you don't understand anything. There's no shame in that, and also especially when I get excited or upset, I tend to start speaking really quickly. So just yell, just be like, stop! What do you mean? What are you talking about? So it's overwhelming. What about investment in green energy? How's that doing? Quantitatively, like, is there a lot of investment in green energy?
Oh no, there's a lot of.
There's huge amounts of investment in green energy, which is great news, right? I mean, in a lot of ways, they're meeting so many of their goals. They've opened up a whole new sector for the global economy, the production of green energy. Companies that are engaged in green energy are making really good profits, and they're finding lots and lots of investment for green energy. What was missing there about one of the other things that green energy was supposed to do? I'm forgetting. Was there something else that green energy, like, we're winning because we're having, like, getting more and more green energy every year. Was there anything else?
Replace oil?
Replacing, yeah, okay. So in a capitalist economy, what happens as green energy investment goes up? This is my well-prepared PowerPoint here. You can see the image, right? So green energy investment is going up. Green energy investment is going up. So in a capitalist economy, what effect does that have on fossil fuel production? It reduces demand? It induces demand. Does anyone have this is embarrassing. I lost my notebook. Does anyone have a scrap piece of paper?
There you go.
Wonderful. I can, okay. Thank you so much. So kind of the story that we're presented with. So this beautifully illustrated pie chart is like total energy usage, and we're coming from a place where green energy is just this tiny little pie slice. But if we increase the total amount of green energy, then obviously that means that what we have is more green energy, less fossil fuel energy. That's the common assumption that is being relied upon every time the media, every time politicians, and every time NGOs are talking about why it's such a good thing to have more green energy, while some of them are also making a lot of profit, coincidentally, right? What's wrong with this picture? What's one of the elemental features of a capitalist economy? What is it based on?
Infinite growth.
Growth. It's based on growth. So the pie, the size of the pie doesn't stay the same, right? If this little piece of paper were the size of the energy pie in 1970, right? Today, the size of that energy pie would be like a freaking paella, like a huge ass pan that could like make rice for 15 people, right? It's a lot more energy. So green energy is increasing, but fossil fuel energy is also increasing. So first off, an increase in one energy source does not necessarily, by any means, reduce other energy sources. But another thing that happens is if you have more total energy, that can actually drive the price down. So someone maybe, just your neighbor, your friendly neighborhood capitalist, they're not a huge capitalist. Let's just say they've invested a modest figure, $100 million, right, in an oil refinery. And they were making 10 million in profit every year, right? We can put this in euros, like 10 million euros in profit every year. But now the cost of energy is going down because there's more energy thanks to all of these ugly wind farms and solar panels and everything like that. So they're only making, the poor capitalist is only making 5 million a year in profits because the price of energy has fallen, and the price of their operation to keep an oil refinery running, that hasn't changed. It's still the same infrastructure. It's still working roughly the same way. What can they do with that $100 million capital that they sunk into the oil refinery?
Invest in data centers?
So can you put an oil refinery into a data center?
No, but you can consume the electricity.
You can consume the electricity, but the 100 million euros, that they spent on that oil refinery, what can they do with that?
Nothing, it's fixed.
It's fixed capital. It's not like a bank account that you can invest it in data centers, which is actually now driving energy demand way up, and kind of erasing some of that effect of having an energy abundance. Once you've sunk 100 million euros into something like an oil refinery, the only way you're going to make any money off of it as a capitalist, like we all are in this room, I'm sure, is to continue to produce oil. You can't turn that into a wind turbine. You can't turn that into a clothing factory. That is either going to be an oil refinery or that is going to be a non-functional, rusting, poisonous oil refinery. So the only way to get back to that, to making that 10 million euros a year of profit, is to try to produce twice as much oil. So as profit margin decreases, if you were making 10% profit, now you're only making 5% profit, the way to make the same amount of cash is to increase the total production. That's what happens across industries as a simplification, but a fairly accurate pattern. That's what happens across industries in capitalism, where either efficiencies or increased supply or many other factors lower the profit margin. So within a sort of economy 101, like basic level capitalist economy class, the prediction that one would have to make, just understanding the basic mechanics of capitalism and how it works, of what happens when we start introducing a new energy source and producing more and more energy, what will happen to the old energy source. The standard prediction should be the production of the old energy source, in this case oil, gas, coal, will also have to go up. And that's in fact the only model that matches the data. Increases in green energy production have gone hand in hand with increases in fossil fuel production. Thank you so much, this was a lifesaver. The only years in which fossil fuel production has gone down, what has been the characteristic of those years?
Economic downturn.
Economic downturn, recessions, the beginning of the COVID pandemic, depressions, the collapse of the Soviet Union, and a huge reduction in the economic activity of a third of a planet, right? So this whole green capitalist myth that the entire mainstream framework is based on only works if you look at individual countries. So within this carbon accounting system, in which supposedly you can have economic growth in capitalism, whether that's capitalism the way that it's practiced in China, capitalism the way that it's practiced in the US, or capitalism the way that it's practiced in the European Union, supposedly you can have economic growth, but decouple that from bad consequences to the environment. And when they say bad consequences to the environment, really they're only looking at carbon emissions. They really don't want to look at anything else because that gets too complicated and science doesn't, really work if you have too many factors. It's hard to make the equation. So let's just forget about, all of the, the polar bears and the forest and everything like that, and focus on something that we can measure, like carbon emissions. Right, so you can have, they say, you can have economic growth and lowering carbon emissions. And some examples that they trot out of that are Chile, Norway, United Kingdom. Some quick features about these economies that have supposedly accomplished carbon decoupling. Norway is in the middle of a huge gas boom. They're doing a whole lot of drilling and offshore installations, getting some of that Arctic gas before the Russians can come and steal it. But do they get counted as the emitter of the gas that they are producing and profiting off of? No, because in the carbon accounting system, it's the country of consumption that is counted as being the emitter of that gas. Norway sells nearly all of that gas. The Norwegians are very environmentally conscious. They only use environmentally friendly sources of energy, and they make sure that other bad countries are the ones that burn the gas that makes them a very wealthy country, right? Because of course, as we know, we should count emissions country by country, because if you're flying in an airplane over the border of a country, there's this sudden really rough spot of turbulence, which is the atmospheric boundary between like Germany and Poland, or between Norway and Finland and Russia, because atmospheres are also nationalistic, right? We don't live in like a planet where everything's interconnected. That's absurd. Chile is they get a whole lot of carbon. They get emissions deductions because Chile supposedly is covered in forest. And forests are very good. Forests draw down carbon from the atmosphere, so it kind of cancels out, whatever other pollution that they might emit. So a couple times I've been visited to different Mapuche communities in struggle, and interestingly, one of the common activities in the Mapuche struggle for liberation from the colonialism of Chile and Argentina is to cut down trees. So naturally, a lot of mainstream NGOs, together with the governments occupying their territories, are like they're getting in the way of our environmental programs. These anti-environmentalist indigenous people, they're ruining things for everyone. The thing is, though, that there are very few forests in Chile and in Argentina, because technocrats either don't care or they just have no fucking clue what a forest is. A forest is not a collection of trees, especially trees of one species that is genetically modified, planted all at the same time in rows, literal freaking rows, and then cut down all at the same time. That is not a forest. That is a plantation. That is a monocrop plantation. That is bad for the people who live there, human and other than human. That is terrible for the soil. That is great for profit, It is not a forest. And it doesn't actually reduce a lot of carbon because the soil, as it gets depleted, starts to let off a lot of carbon and methane. They're much more prone to wildfires. Wildfires, by the way, don't count amongst greenhouse gas emissions when they're doing the carbon accounting, because that's just nature, having this wildfire. Oh, it happens to be burning through a plantation that has caused a major drought in this area of monocrop white pine. Pure coincidence. And then the UK also a lot of offshore gas drilling, major weapons producer. Wars, also actually don't get counted for carbon emissions. So like Russia right now, their carbon budget, like the ongoing invasion against Ukraine is not, that doesn't count in the carbon budget. UK so makes a lot of money off of the military production, and also one of the biggest sectors of the UK economy, financial services, which means they're bankrolling so many of these projects around the world.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that, for example, Morocco is trying to reach its green energy goals, or however they're called, with setting up like solar panels in West Sahara as well.
Yeah, exactly. Land colonization. So you said Western Sahara, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So Morocco currently colonizes Western Sahara, and that's a great place in their mind to steal a huge amount of land with solar panels. Similar things are happening in Oaxaca on indigenous territory. So a lot of that, though, can be ignored with a single issue approach, right? So one of the reasons I don't like to talk about climate change as much as the ecological crisis is if you're only looking at climate change, let's take the question of agriculture. Agriculture is considered a major sector, a major source of carbon emissions. And if you're just focusing on greenhouse gas emissions, you can look at all the machinery that is used for industrial agriculture. And you can look at the transportation, since we live in a system in which food tends to be shipped globally. There are very few regions anymore that feed themselves, and in fact, colonial capitalism tries to destroy this practice. Colonial capitalism is actually based on destroying the practice of local food production, and states historically have always been based on destroying the practice of any kind of food autonomy. So the transportation, the machinery, the manufacture of the agrochemicals, these things get counted. Sometimes also land use conversion will get counted in these carbon budgets. Land use conversion is a technocratic term for cutting down actual forests, draining marshland, which is also really important, in order to plant more monocrop fields of soy, corn, wheat, or whatever it is. So what often gets left out of this question is the destruction of real habitat, right? Because humans have been around for a long time. That's another thing. Anthropogenic climate change. Anthropogenic means caused by humans. This is a fiction. Anthropogenic climate change is not real. Humans do not cause climate change. Humans are not causing the ecological crisis. Capitalism is. The state is. Colonial institutions are. Humans have not been around for only 200 years. Humans have been around for tens of thousands of years. Most human societies have not destroyed their environment. Most human societies have not committed ecocide. A couple human societies have at a regional level, and every time that I've been able to find documentation, they're either states or they're societies that are in the process of increasing their level of hierarchy. And the reason that they are destroying the land, destroying the soil, destroying these living systems that also give them life is a way of propping up that hierarchy, right? So centralized and hierarchical power is causing climate change and is causing this broader ecocide. Humans are not, right? I would guess that there's actually maybe no millionaires or billionaires in this room who just, own just, one or two modest oil refineries. I'm guessing that according to a very differing scale of intersecting and entangled oppressions, nonetheless, all of us have to work for our living. There might be one or two trust fund kids in here, but probably no one who owns a fucking oil refinery or a modest park of 10,000 wind turbines. So we're forced to participate in it. And whatever continent our ancestors come from, at some point or another, whether it was 500 years ago or 2,000 years ago, we were invaded, some of our ancestors were killed, and the survivors were forced to do life the way that the new ruling class told us that we had to. Other things that are left out. So wildfires caused by monocrop forestry often get left out. Soil depletion. Industrial farming is a failed system, but we're at that point where we're still running on momentum on this failed system without recognizing that it's failed yet. Monocrop industrial agriculture is destroying soil all over the world, and basically nearly all of the fertilizers and pesticides and other chemicals that are being used to prop it up, to give it an artificially lengthened life, are coming from petroleum. They're based on mining that is highly destructive to the environment. It's fertilizers that are coming from the industrial scale livestock industry, which is a subset. It's fully integrated in the food. Like the food industry is one industry, right? So like all of those like millions and millions of cows who are imprisoned in like these massive warehouses, all of those millions and millions of sheep who have been turned loose on New Zealand and are emitting so much methane into the air, that is fully integrated within the rest of the capitalist agricultural system. And so that fertilizer is also an important input, keeping industrial agriculture alive. Or also there's other forms of extractivism, like finding large caves. This actually is like a significant fertilizer source in a number of countries. And then mining back thousands of years worth of bat guano, right? These are not sustainable practices. When soil is destroyed, it is no longer a carbon sink. It no longer takes carbon out of the atmosphere. It starts releasing carbon and methane into the atmosphere. Someone brought up land theft, which was great. Whether it's in Western Sahara, whether it's in Oaxaca, whether it's elsewhere, what is referred to only as climate change is intimately related to land theft. It's intimately related to ongoing colonization. It is always the poorest people, whether in urban settings, rural settings, and indigenous people who are most targeted and deliberately targeted for the worst consequences of this system. That also gets left out of this single issue focus on climate change. And then the question of repression, when we resist it, right? Like the folks who have been talking about this in a realistic way for the longest, roughly in chronological order, would be indigenous people, anarchists, and radical environmentalists. Indigenous people are still being exposed to actually genocidal practices around the world. Anarchists are routinely treated as terrorists in police operations, one country after another, and were tortured and sometimes killed, other times have to go on the run, and other times are lucky to only be, surveilled, arrested, go through years of a, criminal process and all that. That is also a part of the ecological crisis, right? Making sure that most people believe that there is, this light has been, yeah, I don't know, it's trying to tell me something. That is there's a lot of violence and media marginalization and well-meaning academics who remain in dialogue with these institutions that have a perfect track record of failure. All of these things come together in a confluence to make people either unaware or afraid to consider the real forms of activity that we all need to increasingly support that are actually realistic responses to the problem, rather than continuing this track of green energy that makes things worse. And that clearly and obviously makes things worse. This is like we have all the data in the world. In one of the few instances when it's like a clearly quantifiable question, like we have the hypothesis, this is our model for how capitalism works. Let's compare it to like the last 100 years of like greenhouse gas emissions data and GDP, like global economic production data, and like it matches up. It's the only model that matches the data. And like all of the media, all the politicians, most of the major NGOs are still spinning this bullshit myth about green growth. Like I said, I get worked up, so I'm running way behind on my notes. Despair. Does anyone in this room know anything about despair? About feeling like we're fucked, about not wanting to think about the future, not even wanting to think about anything that is not right in front of us, unable to think about things or engage with things that are not right on our screen, feeling like there's no hope, not knowing what to do, feeling miserable, not feeling anything, suddenly crying without being able to control it, having to have left home, having to have left the place where you live because of war, because of racism, because of rising prices, because it got flooded and not rebuilt, they got burnt and not rebuilt. Any of these, I'm getting a sense that some of these are common experiences. I want to validate all of those feelings because all of those experiences are real and all of those experiences can be traumatic and all those experiences are happening to a growing number of people around the world as a part of this system. And I also want us to turn inwards, to turn outwards, and to turn to one another, to recognize that the despair is a part of the problem and the despair is also built in to capitalism in the state. And like whether it's electoral democratic politics or whether it's totalitarian fascistic politics, the despair is built in and it disempowers us. So actually like think about it, like reach out to whatever kind of despair or whatever is closest to it that you feel, reach into yourself and connect with it. Think for a moment, imagine one place that's actually in your real life, a place that you walk through, the place where you live, a place that's special and important to you. A place that's probably under threat, whether it's from rising rents or building new condos or pollution or warfare or genocide. Just, don't look at me for a while. Just turn to the people around you and you don't have to say anything. Just make eye contact. That's a tough request. Okay, do it, please. I demand that you do it. Thank you for doing that. So there's very little certainty about the rest of this year, next year, the rest of the decade, the rest of the century, right? Like it's a pretty big range if we look at I'm too familiar. I'll stay here. Okay, I gotta use my. It's a pretty big range if we look at so this was an actual quote from one of the scientists involved in they basically put out a study where they were reviewing, they weren't just doing one study, they were reviewing dozens and dozens of studies by scientists using very, very tried and tested climate modeling that came out with that estimate of 1 billion humans killed by the end of the century. And in the kind of mainstream news article talking about it, which didn't get circulated very widely, he said that actually the figure of 1 billion deaths, that's their conservative estimate, because if you even go for the most likely estimate, the highest probability estimate, then you don't get taken seriously because it seems too extreme. So with a conservative estimate of 100 billion humans getting killed, and then at the far end, honestly, somewhere between 95% of the global human population dying, possible human extinction. That's if these different tipping points, we know these tipping points exist, but no one really knows how much of an effect they will have, when they will actually get tipped. But at 5 degrees Celsius of global warming, most of the crops that the human population feeds itself on don't really grow anymore. A huge portion of the world's population lives in coastal areas that will be underwater. the capital, like the damage to capital, like basically capitalism kind of just collapses, and we're left without the infrastructure to feed ourselves, things like that. But I also want to, I want to also talk about how necessary it is to try to imagine the unimaginable that happens in the other direction. Those projections are all within a range of, if greenhouse gas emissions continue on the current trajectory, if different policies actually bring more reductions to greenhouse gas emissions, or if, like, I don't know, the Trump effect and greenhouse gas emissions like increase, mixed together with questions of tipping points and things of that nature. So that's what scientists and media tend to look at, but there will often be this vague statement that if there is a very radical reduction, they won't use the word radical, but if there's a major reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, then it could be much, much less. But that's less likely because they don't see any plan for how to make that happen. And that is a very, very important feature there, that they don't see any plan. So if you look at the United Nations framework around climate change, right, their plan is entirely based on government regulation and investment, which is a pretty bad plan if states are inherently ecocidal, states are inherently bad for their ecosystems, and capitalism is completely ecocidal and is based on turning life into profit, both of which I think are just plainly true, and we can very clearly demonstrate that they're true. So the mainstream framework says if in some way we could really, really bring greenhouse gas emissions way, way down, then, actually we wouldn't have to face a billion human deaths, or one of the largest mass extinction events in human history. But they just scratch their heads and don't really know how that might be possible. Let's put that on hold for a second. To say that I actually don't want y'all to leave tonight feeling like everything's fucked and feeling more depressed than you might already be. And I actually do want to spend as much time as possible talking about things that give me a lot of hope and things that are based in the real world. But before getting into how it's actually possible and how actually it's already starting to happen, let's just imagine a really great scenario, the ones that the scientists and the mainstream media and most of the environmental NGOs don't ever dare name in detail, that we abolish capitalism, we abolish states, we abolish private property, and return to a relationship of commoning with the ecosystems that give us life. Commoning meaning not just holding things in common, but recognizing ourselves as a common part of the ecosystem, that we're also a part of the land, and the land's a part of us. Abolishing industrial agriculture and shifting towards ecosystemic forms of agriculture, forms of food, of growing food, ecosystemic ways of feeding ourselves, actually is what I want to say, that are not based on monocropping, not based on profit, but actually based on taking care of the ecology, recognizing that we're a part of the ecology, feeding ourselves and feeding other people. Feeding rivers, feeding the soil, feeding the forests, feeding other animals, feeding the trees, feeding all of us. Recognizing that actually we don't really survive in the long term by taking food away, taking value away from other systems. We survive in the long term by recognizing that we actually only live thanks to these broader living systems and not the systems of the institutions of capitalism in the state. What if we turned every golf course into a garden or a forest? What if we ripped up all the asphalt, ended car culture, stopped using cars, localized most of the activity that we needed in order to sustain ourselves, to clothe ourselves, to house ourselves? then actually that would be a pretty rapid transition, not just to a very low emission society, but to a society that was negative emissions, to a society that was taking carbon out of the atmosphere, ending some of the major sources of methane emissions, healing the soil, bringing back real forests, helping other species adapt to the major changes that are already happening. It's too late to stop major changes. I mean, at least 10 million human beings, only looking at human beings, are already being killed every year by the effects of the ecological crisis. We don't know how many species are going extinct every year, gone forever, because of the effects right now of the ecological crisis. We do know that it's certainly happening, but we could help as many of us as possible to adapt and to survive. That is actually possible. And we don't know if the point when it's too late is next year or in 10 years, or if it was actually last year and we don't realize it yet. But I also want to push against this idea of too late. In complex systems, there are tipping points, right? So a complex system is basically like a simple system is this pen, right? The pen is out, the pen is in. A complex system, you have millions of different things like this that are all interreacting, all pushing each other's buttons, all writing all over each other, all defining and redefining one another. And those systems seem stable, they are stable, even though they're also immensely chaotic. They're just buzzing with all of this different activity, right? Like the most complex computer that's been invented is not yet capable of tracking all of this activity, all of these different factors. So complex systems are resilient, right? Like you could have like a small asteroid hit, and like, there would be some waves, but then like things would straighten out, things would stay on track. But every complex system also has a limited amount of resilience. Depending on the type of interference, the type of change, the type of damage that it's experiencing, it'll look like things are holding steady, and then something falls apart. And then you enter a period of systemic chaos in which the overarching patterns are just not there anymore. They're falling apart, and the system is gradually moving towards another stable state. That's actually something really, really beautiful about this planet and about this universe, is that it is self-organizing. It is incredibly complex, it is incredibly chaotic, but it's also self-organizing. Right now, the stable system on the planet is one in which we have polar ice caps, one in which we have a lot of temperate forests, savannas, wetlands, tropical rainforests, and we have about a third of the planet's surface is land area, the rest is ocean. And unless there's this huge radical change, who knows when, to really end all of these causes that are, all of these factors that are destroying living systems on this planet, then what's going to happen is we're going to move towards some version of a stable system of a hotter planet, probably without polar ice caps, with less land area as sea levels rise, and that will mean the end of a lot of ways of life. That will mean the end of a lot of forms of life, that's a fucking tragedy. And I don't believe in punishment, but I hope that we do figure out some way to make sure that we always remember, at the very least we remember for 1,000 generations, what and who was responsible for that kind of just extreme violence against all of us. So that we organize our societies so that those kind of behaviors of treating the earth like it's just a pool of resources for our enrichment, behaviors of authoritarianism, behaviors of exploitation, so that those are always seen for the dangers that they are. But in all probability, there will still be life. In all probability, there will still be human life. So at any moment, whether it's now, whether it's tomorrow, whether it's in 100 years, taking action, if it's the right kind of action, will make things better, will increase our resilience, will increase our possibilities for some kind of collective survival and for adaptation. And the right kind of action, no one has all the answers, but we do have history. We do have the present. We have an immense record of, let's vote for this political party and see what happens. We have an immense record of, let's try to turn this into a way to make money and see if that makes things better. We have an immense record of so many different forms of struggle or of reform or of change that are sincere, that went in really, really bad directions. And then we have so many other examples that show us paths with limitations, paths with strengths and weaknesses. No one has found a magic bullet. No one has found a simple solution that just fixes everything, or y'all wouldn't be wasting a perfectly good evening, listening to me maybe. Hopefully we would be like dancing or like, making food and, eating. There was making food, fortunately, so that's a good thing. So there's no simple answers, but we actually have a whole lot of information, a whole lot of experiences that we can learn from to find the strengths and weaknesses of different approaches, the limits that we need to find new ways to overcome. We can't do that if we don't have continuity in our movements. So continuity can be a lot of things. Continuity means knowing a lot about the struggles of those in the generations before you. Continuity might mean knowing a lot about the specific history of the land that you stand on, the land that's currently giving you life. Or it might mean knowing the story of people who have had to move from one land to another, people who have had to cross continents to stay alive. I grew up in the States, lived half my life in Catalonia. In the States, there were amazingly powerful revolutionary struggles in the 60s and 70s, and when I was growing up, it was hard to find a book about them, much less find someone to talk with, to actually share their experiences, for it to feel real, to know like these struggles are actually real, and I can like understand how they feel. I can understand what people learned. Also, a lot of the books that that were coming out were not always from the best perspectives because of the kind of factors that determine who survives those struggles, who's still in prison, who comes out traumatized and unable to speak about it. So continuity, I think, is really, really important to our struggles, especially since we keep making the same mistakes or similar mistakes again and again and again and again. I was actually noticing there's this book back there, which is one of my favorite anarchist books, and almost no anarchists have read it, even though it's by Kropotkin, who's not entirely unknown. But it's his book on the French Revolution, and it probably hasn't been read because it's like really, really thick, which I think is good when you have like a big thick book like that, because you're reading it, and then all of a sudden you see the cops are like trying to arrest someone to deport them, or Nazis are coming, then you could also use it as a brick. It's a multi-purpose book, but it goes into a lot of useful detail about the French Revolution, and I had this experience multiple times while I was reading it that just felt like crap. This almost feels like this is like a this could be about the Russian Revolution. This almost feels like this could be about the Mexican Revolution. This almost feels like it could be about the Spanish Revolution. Like there were so many lessons here that seem to have gotten lost. So many clear patterns that repeat and repeat and repeat. Sometimes our movements are destroyed by repression. Sometimes our movements are destroyed by the right, by Nazis, by fascists, by a dictatorship. Also, sadly, many times our movements are destroyed by people who started out as revolutionaries, who think that, let's just try this more convenient path one more time. Maybe it'll work out differently somehow than all of the other times. And I did just a moment ago say that it's never too late to make things better. It's never too late to take action, and that will always, unless you're taking certain kinds of action, that will always make things better for those around you, for those who will come after you. But also just, if we can't learn to recognize and name these patterns that are really going to take us nowhere, when we're facing down possibly most of the, and Germany is clearly like a fairly wealthy country with like way better access to healthcare than most countries, and still there's like a high chance that even most of the people in this room will die earlier, even significantly earlier than we might have otherwise because of some of the effects of this ongoing crisis. Like if at this point we can't say like we don't have any more time for these convenient, these quick fixes, for reformism, for some authoritarian party that's going to make things better for us. We need to actually dive into it all of the way. Go back to the very roots of this problem. In colonialism, in the state, in white supremacy, we need to look at how all of these institutions are globally connected. It's the same institutions all around the world, although in every part of the world, they act in different ways, because they're deploying different facets of a strategy, but there are really only a few variations of the strategy between what the US government is using, between what European states tend to use, between what Russia is using, between what China uses. There are different forms of counterinsurgency strategy to keep us down, but in this current century, it's all some version of that. Let's talk about some beautiful things. Would anyone like to hear about some beautiful things? I'm serious. Shaking your head. You're addicted to the pain. What's that?
This is a special snowflake.
I'm going to talk about 3 different experiences. All of which I was lucky enough to take some kind of part in. The first one at the most superficial level, but in November I went to Brazil. For about a year I'd been organizing together with a couple friends from Brazil to do sort of a project there. Do y'all know what the COP summits are? I love the name. So COP 29, COP 30. So these are the summits of the United Nations Framework on Climate Change. COP 29, they kind of wanted to kind of be a little bit quiet about that one because it was in Azerbaijan. I think 80% of Azerbaijan's economy is from fossil fuels. And also just earlier that year, Azerbaijan was still actively engaged in ethnic cleansing against an Armenian minority. So they kind of actually mostly kept that one out of the news. And they really wanted the COP 30 this past November to be like the big event that would really restore people's faith in a system to try to stop climate change that has been able to funnel probably at this point hundreds of billions of dollars in investments, has been able to change government policy in dozens of countries around the world, has been able to get commitments around emissions reductions targets from most countries in the world, and in 30 years we still have rising emissions. Like it's just like the most. If its purpose were actually to reduce emissions, to deal with the climate crisis, and for many people it is. I think most of probably not the directors of NGOs who are making 100,000 euros, but most of the people who work for them, they probably actually do want to make this better. All of the businesses investing in the whole question, I think it would be naive to make the same assumption. But even for the few who actually believe in that process, this is just the most embarrassing, monumental failure that can be imagined. So they wanted to bring it to Brazil, where you have one of the most left-wing socialist governments in a major country around the world, Lula da Silva of the Workers' Party. And you have the Amazon, which white people love to talk about as the lungs of the planet, right? Even though there are many, many ecosystems that are just as able and active in terms of cleaning the planet's atmosphere and absorbing carbon. It just coincidentally happens to be in a colonized country in the global south that suddenly those forests belong to the whole planet. Which we can probably guess who is meant by the whole planet, whereas the Atlantic forests and the Great Plains in North America, those don't belong to the whole planet. Those are for the cattle industry, for the soy industry, for football stadiums. So anyways, these Brazilian comrades and I, we wanted to do something to bring attention to some really amazing projects and struggles that are, you know, being organized on territories occupied by the Brazilian state, to basically try to create another push to convince as many sincere people as possible to stop taking the United Nations seriously, stop taking green capitalism seriously, stop taking all these major NGOs seriously, and look at actually revolutionary anti-colonial responses that really get to the roots of the problem. We spoke with some really amazing people. The two friends that I was organizing with and other comrades that they were connected with, all of them are participants in some of these projects, right? None of us are academics, none of us are professionals, all of us are participants in the movements where we live. They just brought me along to, try to put out some things in English too. I'll only talk about one of those projects, but there's more out there if you're interested, and all of it's very inspiring. But Teia dos Povos means Web of the Peoples, and it's a sort of organizational experience that has come out of the MST, which is like the landless workers movement, which includes over 1.5 million people who are generally either people who are fleeing urban poverty, or rural peoples who are resisting the pressures of capitalism to move into extreme poverty in the cities, in the favelas, who occupy land, who take back land, whether it's abandoned land that was farmed to death through the plantation system, or land that's abandoned in other ways. Teia dos Povos is sort of like a more explicitly anti-colonial, anti-capitalist tendency or articulation within the MST, trying to push as many communities as possible in more radical directions, also connecting with communities outside of the MST, because the MST does a lot of amazing, important work, but they have a more reformist horizon, and like the left in general, they have a colonial mindset of kind of more pushing for this common identity of the campesino, peasant or agricultural worker, rather than recognizing the many indigenous peoples and the quilombos and many other experiences that are not homogenous and that can exist in solidarity, but without necessarily being unified into these blocks of sameness. So Teia dos Povos does include some indigenous communities that are fighting to get their land back. It includes quilombos. Quilombos are communities formed by people of the African diaspora. Many of them were started hundreds of years ago by people who revolted against slavery and either burned their plantations down or fled their plantations and found places where they could live, often in solidarity with the surrounding indigenous peoples. And they created communities that were not statist, that were not capitalist, that were based in a more caring relationship towards one another, towards the land, and towards their neighbors. And many of those quilombos still exist. And then other communities that are lower class, interracial, and a mix of poor people from rural and from urban areas. So one of the comrades who was helping with this project lives in a Teia dos Povos community of 300 people. The community is called Terra Vista. It was a chocolate plantation. And when I say plantation, I mean in the ugliest way possible. Like the workers there were laboring on a monocrop plantation, like in the full sunlight, just really hard, working all day, sun up to sundown. And they had armed overseers on horseback with whips and pistols, managing them while they worked. That land was farmed to death. And 32 years ago, it was just grass. Like this had been forest. This was a part of the Mata Atlântica, the Atlantic forest ecosystem, which is just where it can be and has been an amazing, thriving tropical forest ecosystem, and it was just grass. Then several dozen families took over the land, and it's I'm sometimes getting confused between acres and hectares. It's either 300 hectares or 1,000 hectares, but in any case, it's a very large extension of land. They took it over. They were fighting with police for 2 years against multiple evictions until finally they were able to convince the police to leave them alone, that they were not going to give up. And yeah, now there's over 300 people living there. And they are, well, let me just like get to it. Like when I arrived there, it is amazingly beautiful. It is a real forest. It is a forest that people feed themselves from. It's a forest also that feeds so many other species. There are so many birds and lizards, capybaras come through at the night, all different kinds of species, bringing back many native trees. And they're also kind of like, I mean, I think mostly it's because chocolate is actually really, really good, but also kind of works as like a fuck you to capitalism, that they're growing chocolate there again, but they're growing chocolate in the traditional way, which in a lot of forms of a lot of indigenous food systems, depending on the climate, will use some kind of forest gardening. So in Brazilian Portuguese, it's agrofloresta, but the best translation in English, I think, is forest gardening, where you're not treating the land as just a plot to exploit, to produce as much, whatever food crop you can get the most money from, not thinking about what it's going to look like in 10 years. You are understanding that we're a part of the land is a part of us, and we, in the long term, only exist if we can exist mutually. And so there are plenty of trees growing there, trees that they've brought back, trees that they've planted, trees that they protect, that humans can't get any food from. But those are trees that are important for the soil, or they're trees that are important for other species. They give just the right amount of shade, since chocolate trees that grow about this tall, so they're not very tall trees, but they're shade tolerant. They can grow in like partial sunlight. And so they take over the land, they plant the first generation trees, the trees that are able to reclaim land that has been reduced to just sort of a grass wasteland. And they plant some crops and some food trees, whether it's like bananas, which can grow easily there even though they're not native, or other species that are either native or from very close by, like acai trees and chocolate trees. And then they also plant the what they call centenarios, like the trees that will last for centuries, the trees that will grow high, that will really anchor the soil. First, actually, they planted trees along the riverside, so that there's a small river that went through this land, and when they arrived, there was no water. There was a clear river valley there, but because of these capitalist practices of agriculture, it had completely dried up. And that's something that's happening all over the place. I understand that there's also problems with the problem's not with the rainfall, the problem's not with like the amount of, here in Dresden and in the area, that there's like increasing water scarcity, and that's being exacerbated by some new industrial projects as well. So one of the first things that they did was to plant native trees along the river banks, and they actually brought the river back. And when I was there, it was like a beautiful river. People come from all around, also from outside of the community, because it's the cleanest water in a really long distance in any direction. People are swimming in it, just having fun. Just really, really beautiful. And this forest is also a home for all these people. They've occupied the old buildings, from when it was a plantation. They've built new buildings. There's a couple schools on the territory. There's a clinic for healthcare. There's a chocolate factory where they make their own chocolate, working at their own pace. They also do that for the things that they can't grow or make themselves. They can bring in some income, since currently, sadly, capitalism still exists. We still need money in a lot of cases. And as part of this really, really amazing, generous network of solidarity, a lot of the food crops they grow are actually to grow seeds for other communities. So the friend who hosted me there, I was like staying in his little room. He had just gotten back from, so this is in Bahia, This is in the state of Bahia, so it's like, this was more in the interior, but it's basically sort of in the middle of Brazil, but a bit closer to the coast. Brazil's a huge country. He had just come from the far, far south of Brazil, which is one of the places where colonial genocides have been the most brutal. It's the place with a lot of the most hardcore white supremacist plantation owners, and it's a place where even today, like in the dictatorship, rich people, and they don't even have to be very rich at all, just like a small plantation owner, can just pay hitmen to go assassinate whatever indigenous organizer or whatever agricultural organizer is giving them problems, and they know that they can just get someone murdered and never have any consequences, and that actually happens frequently. While I was in Brazil in November, there was a small massacre against a Guarani Kiowa community in the south that had been, resisting attempts by one of the local ranchers to steal more of their land, and then, a couple masked gunmen, show up on a motorbike one day, shoot a few people dead and take off, and the police are going to take the names of who's dead and then leave, and everyone knows who hired the hitman, but nothing's going to happen. And actually, it's actually amongst the Guarani Kiowa. These are one of several people in the south of Brazil who have a very important relationship with a type of maíz branco, a type of white corn, which is a traditional variety of corn, and it's at the center of their worldview, at the center of a lot of spiritual practices for them, and at the center of their agroecological, their food systems, right? Their ways of growing food and taking care of the ecosystem, and that is also, I think, a common feature with a lot of indigenous and other anti-colonial struggles, where a lot of things that in Western languages we have to separate into all of these different categories are really accomplishing all of those tasks, in a symphonic way, or kind of all together. In a lot of these struggles, in the approaches that a lot of these struggles take, because we're talking about this one plant, and how it has spiritual, ecological, economic, agricultural, nutritional, functions is kind of an ugly word, but so this person who was hosting me, he had just got back from the south because they had grown about 1,000 kilos of this ancestral variety of white corn that the Guarani Kiowa communities in the south, none of them had been able to access it in 50 years because it was almost extinguished as one of the consequences of colonialism. And now all of a sudden, different communities are dividing up hundreds of kilos of this so they can restart their traditional system of feeding themselves, which is also a way of taking care of the earth and asserting their autonomy. I should move forward, but that's just one community in a network that's spanning across Brazil, and it's just a really beautiful, inspiring thing, and it doesn't really get mentioned in the mainstream, but that's the kind of thing that we can learn a lot from. We can find some patterns in that and see how we can take be inspired by that and maybe take some similar approaches in a very different context, of course, and definitely something that we should support in the face of repression. One thing that I participated in from the beginning in Catalonia was called La Trobada de Infraestructuras Libertarias, which translates to basically anarchist infrastructures gatherings, right? So in one moment we did something that I think in a lot of places radical movements just don't do enough, which was stop, take a moment, and analyze our situation, analyze what our enemies are doing, analyze what these institutions that want to destroy and control all of us are doing, analyze where our weaknesses are, what we're doing well, what we're not doing well, and what we have. And we in the broadest sense possible, right? We're not a party. We don't only work with people who agree exactly and completely with us, but those we share solidarity with, those we trust to be on the same side as us when things get ugly or get worse, or those who we already have some kind of working relationship with. And one thing that we found was in those years we were doing much better at beating the police to the point that we had multiple times taken over neighborhoods and were able to transform those neighborhoods, whether that's certain transformations with banks and police stations and the kind of businesses that gentrify a neighborhood, and other kinds of transformations that don't involve fire, with parks, public spaces, gardens, stopping evictions, allowing people to stay in their houses. But then on the other side, in terms of what we were creating in a more lasting sense, we actually realized that there were many, many projects, because we kept having this feeling like, but we're not actually creating anything. We're really good at the destruction part currently, but we're not really good at the creating part. But then as we actually analyzed it, we're like, wait, we know this person, we know these people who have these healthcare collectives, we know these people who have these gardens, who like make a lot of food, we know these people who have printing presses, we know these people who have like a tool shop. And the pattern that we noticed was that there were just very few connections between these different projects. So when people were moving towards more constructive, less conflictive forms of organizing, in many ways they were putting together amazing projects, but there started to be a separation between them and other aspects of the movement, including other movement projects that were very, very similar in terms of being constructive and being based in developing our skills for autonomy, right? And so we kind of saw that capitalism already sort of offers this idea that you can, like, you know, produce things in an alternative way. You can produce things in an alternative way, but you should turn it into a business, right? So that's already like a mode that exists under capitalism. And so basically we started creating these 3-day long gatherings 2 times a year to bring together all of these different projects that were looking at, in our analysis, an infrastructure for a liberated society, right? So if an infrastructure is what makes the different modes of life possible, in capitalism, the infrastructure is the highway system, the ports, the electrical grid, et cetera, et cetera. At least in our mind, for a struggle of liberation, infrastructure looks very different, and it's actually about the foundations for putting into practice the relationships we want, the foundations for learning the skills that allow us to actually get our autonomy back, to be able to organize our own lives. So for us, it actually looked like things like print shops, collective houses, gardens, healthcare collectives, and things of that nature. And some of these were already organizing themselves, but only within sectors. So all the independent radio stations were organized together to coordinate. Some different presses were organized together, but presses and radio stations and healthcare collectives and farms often hadn't posed for themselves, what's the advantage of getting together? What can we make together that we can't make separately? And that for me was a really inspiring experience, seeing how many new possibilities arose from making those kinds of connections. That it was really a step towards an autonomous society, a society that is existing against and outside of the colonial society that we're all forced to live in currently. Again, I'm taking up a lot of time, so please feel free to talk to me about that afterwards, and I can point you to some sources, especially if you read Spanish. The last one, really quick, thinking of the people who are being attacked, assaulted, tortured, deported, and sometimes killed right now in different parts of the U.S. by the immigration cops. Over the last 20 years or so, there's been an incredible wave of uprisings against racism and against police, as really part of the same thing, not as 2 separate issues. Because everyone is affected by one way or another in police violence, especially if you start to resist the police or stand up in solidarity with those who are more frequently targeted than you are. And white supremacy is one of the organizing principles of global capitalism in the state, whether you're in Dresden or Detroit or Sao Paulo. It takes on different strategies in different places, of course. But so... I just want to name the importance of that, and that it didn't just happen by magic. It didn't just happen because, one day, the police killed someone even though they'd already killed 1,000 people just that year, and then one day people just decided to fight back and start rioting and burning down the police stations, and for once make the police afraid and liberate our neighborhoods, if only for a few days or a few weeks or a few months, from the police. Even though there is always an element of spontaneity to it, right? You can't plan out the uprisings. You can't say, this is the day that the revolution is going to start. But there also was a lot of intentionality. There was a lot of fearless, persistent work naming the violence, naming that the police are racist murderers and torturers, and we don't want them. We want a world without them because they make life impossible, right? We want an ecosystem of revolt, just like we want society to organize as part of an ecosystem again, which means you don't get to decide how other people live their lives. You don't have to be in agreement with everyone, and conflict is always going to be there, whether that's because some people are eating other people, whether that's because, the growth of one habitat means like another habitat loses some ground. But there are certain ways of being in the world that make life impossible. And capitalism, the state, the police are absolutely ways of being that are enemies to all life, that make ecosystemic forms of living impossible. So spreading this unapologetically, we need a world without the police. The police are unacceptable. They cannot be reformed. They are killing people, they are torturing people, and this is true across countries. Some countries rely a whole lot more on social democratic methods of like buying off resistance, but still the police when they have to maintain order, they have the same weaponry, they have the same training, and there were also a lot of strategies in a lot of places that had taken inspiration from uprisings in other parts of the world, whether Greece or Egypt, and certain decisions that were made that whenever the police kill someone and we find out about it, we will respond in some way. If there's only 10 of us, then maybe we see what we can do in the night and get away, so everyone can be out on the streets to fight another day without going to prison, without getting locked up. If there's 100 people, let's see how long we can block this busy street for. If there's 1,000 people, all of a sudden there's new possibilities. And people just kept going at it, not being sure if we would be 10 people or if we would be 1,000 people. And this actually changed the culture, and it changed people's ideas of what's possible. And all of these things are related to the ecological crisis, because the ecological crisis enfolds all of the ways that capitalism and the state have basically existed through warfare, constant warfare against all of us. Whether that's the kinds of pacification strategies, the peace of the graveyard, or whether that's moments of open warfare. It changes, it cycles back and forth in different parts of the world, but there is no healthy, sustainable future with those institutions. Those institutions thrive off of turning life into dead matter that they profit off of turning free beings and free relationships into forms of power that they exploit and control. So we can't take care of the land if we have no access to it because the land is private property. But we can take back the land if we have an ability to go head to head with the police and sometimes have the hope, however temporary, of winning. But if we're just focusing on that, well then what are we going to do when we have access to the land, whether that's the land of a neighborhood or whether that's a forest or whether that's land that's being farmed to death? If we don't challenge these colonial views of ourselves as individuals existing above or outside of nature, then we're just going to reproduce the thing that we were fighting against with slightly altered aesthetics. So if we can then learn the skills of feeding ourselves as a part of the ecosystem, housing ourselves as a part of the ecosystem, understanding that we don't just start from a blank slate, right? We have all of these buildings that are already sitting here. We have all of this asphalt. We have all of these poisons in the environment. How do we start transforming them? Starting from now, starting from where we're at. And then finally building these networks that don't have to exist, through like a democratic form of hierarchy where we vote on what's the correct law, what's the correct political program. We allow each other our heterogeneity. We allow each other our distance because we have this basic rule of solidarity that when it's a question of survival, we have each other's backs, right? We're going to have conflict in the meantime, but that's okay. We're fighting for survival, for collective survival, and we can do this through a decentralized networked approach, sharing our resources and moving us forward. So there's a lot of reasons for hope out there, and there's always reasons to take action, to take care of ourselves, to create this continuity, and to keep going. So at the very least, no matter how grim things are, when our moment comes, when our time is up, we're leaving things for others to carry forward. We're leaving things in a slightly better way for the next generation so that they have better chances than we had, and so that they don't have to make the same mistakes that we had. We don't have the correct answers to give them, but at the very least we'll have lessons. We'll have things that they can learn from, things that they can innovate on and build on. I have been speaking way longer than I planned. I hope it was helpful and useful, and I really, really would love to actually hear from all of you, because I do have a discussion prompt that I think could be actually like really helpful for folks here. So we'll turn off the recording and.